The Crab Queen's Little Groom. Never Kidnap Your Future Husband. Part 1. The Unexpected Choke. The humidity in Miami had a way of sticking to the soul, and today it was particularly thick. Madison Miller, 15 and currently convinced that her life was the epicenter of global boredom, leaned against the kitchen island. She was nursing a tall glass of iced tea, the condensation slick against her palm. Her mother, Miranda, was humming a tune that sounded vaguely like an 80s power ballad while she rhythmically chopped bell peppers for fajitas. Miranda was a woman of sensible bob haircuts and ergonomic gardening clogs, the last person one would associate with the word chaos. "Mom," Madison sighed, watching a bead of condensation roll down the side of her glass. "Did you ever, do anything? Before the mortgage in the carpool and the HOA meetings? Did you ever have an adventure?" Madison expected a story about a backpacking trip through Europe, where they stayed in a hostel with bedbugs, or perhaps a daring night involving a borrowed car and a drive-in movie. Miranda didn't even look up from the peppers. "Well, there was the time the giant crab queen kidnapped your father to marry him, and I had to go and rescue him." Madison didn't just cough. She had a full-body physiological rejection of the sentence. A spray of iced tea hit the granite countertop. She clutched her throat, eyes watering, gasping for air, as her lungs tried to decide if they were meant for breathing or drowning. The what, the who, the why? Madison finally managed, her voice a raspy squeak. Miranda wiped a stray bit of green pepper onto the floor and finally looked at her daughter. Her expression was terrifyingly casual, the same look she used when discussing the price of kale. The Crab Queen. Honestly, Madison, don't be so dramatic. It was 1998. Things were different then. "Mom, you're hallucinating," Madison said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "You're describing a B-movie from the 50s, or a bad acid trip." "And how would you know about acid trips?" her mother asked, knowing fully well no answer would benefit her 15-year-old daughter. She winked, adding a mischievous touch to her smirk. "It was August in Hawaii," Miranda said, her eyes glazing over with the distinct, soft light of nostalgia. "We were 12. Your father was much scrawnier then? Delicious, apparently, by crustacean standards. Sit down, Maddie. If you're going to judge my youth, at least listen to the deposition." Madison sat. She didn't have a choice. Her brain had stalled, and the only way to jumpstart it was to hear the rest of this insanity. Part 2. The Tide Turns. The story, as Miranda told it, began on the north shore of Oahu, where both of their families had been stationed. In 1998, Miranda and Malcolm were inseparable. They weren't dating. That was a concept for people with driver's licenses. But they were bound by the peculiar, fierce loyalty of childhood friends. Malcolm was a boy of knobby knees and a constant peeling sunburn on his nose. Miranda was a girl who carried a Swiss Army knife in her pocket and harbored a deep-seated suspicion of anything that moved slower than she did. "We were at the cove," Miranda narrated, her hands moving rhythmically as she continued to cook. "The tourists didn't know about it. It was just a jagged crescent of volcanic rock and white sand, tucked behind a wall of palm trees. The water was that turquoise color that looks fake in photographs." They had spent the morning hunting for sea glass. Malcolm was winning, having found a rare piece of cobalt blue that he intended to turn into a necklace for his mother. "The air went still," Miranda said, her voice dropping an octave. "You know that feeling before a storm? Not the wind, but the weight of the air? It was like that, and then we heard the clicking. It wasn't a single click. It was a rhythmic metallic staccato, like 1,000 castanets being played underwater. From the tide pools, they emerged." At first, Madison thought her mother meant normal crabs, the kind you find in a bucket. "They were the size of St. Bernards," Miranda corrected. "Deep, iridescent violet shells. Their eyes weren't on stalks. They were embedded in the shell like glowing amber jewels. And they didn't scuttle sideways, they marched." The crabs had swarmed out of the surf with a terrifying military precision. Malcolm, paralyzed by the sheer surreality of the sight, hadn't moved fast enough. "They didn't pinch him to hurt him," Miranda explained. They hooked their claws into his cargo shorts. 4 of them lifted him off the ground like he was a palanquin. He didn't even scream at first, he just looked at me and said, "Miranda, I think I'm being abducted." "And you just watched?" Madison asked, leaning forward. "I ran, Maddie, but not away. I grabbed my snorkel gear and a heavy piece of driftwood. By the time I reached the water's edge, they were dragging him into the mouth of the deep. The mouth of the deep was a sea cave that only appeared at the lowest of tides. Local legends said it led to the center of the earth. The kids just thought it was a cool place to find dead fish." Miranda watched as the violet carpet of crabs vanished into the darkness of the cave, taking Malcolm with them. She didn't go for help. She knew that if she told an adult, Malcolm would be gone by the time they finished laughing at her. She took a deep breath, adjusted her goggles, and dove into the receding tide. Inside the cave, the water gave way to a shimmering, bioluminescent grotto. The walls weren't stone, they were lined with living barnacles that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic blue light. As Miranda dragged herself onto a ledge of slick, black rock, she saw the kingdom. It was an architectural impossibility. Towers of polished coral, bridges made of braided seaweed, and thousands of crabs of every shape and size moving through the streets of a submerged city. And in the center, on a throne carved from the skull of a prehistoric whale, sat the queen. "She was the size of an SUV," Miranda said, her voice tinged with a reluctant respect. Her shell was encrusted with pearls the size of grapefruit. She had a crown of sharpened obsidian. And there, sitting on a pile of damp kelp at her feet, was your father. He looked like he wanted to cry, but mostly, he just looked annoyed that he'd dropped his blue sea glass. The queen had spoken, not in words, but in a series of vibrations that resonated in the marrow of Miranda's bones. The golden one. The vibrations had hummed. "He shall be my prince consort. His skin is the color of the setting sun, and his spirit is as pliable as wet sand. The wedding shall be at the turn of the high tide." "Wait," Madison interrupted, her head spinning. "The crab queen wanted to marry Dad because he had a sunburn?" "He was the golden one, Maddie. To a giant crustacean who lives in a dark hole, a kid with a grade 2 sun scorch looks like a deity." Miranda described her first attempt at a rescue. She had tried to sneak along the upper ridges of the coral towers, using her snorkel as a makeshift blowgun, loaded with sharpened seashells. She had managed to take out 2 guards, but the sheer volume of the crab army was overwhelming. She was captured within minutes, but she wasn't killed. "I mean, yeah," said Madison. "You're in front of me telling the story." They both giggled. "The queen found me amusing," Miranda continued, a grim smile touching her lips. "She didn't see me as a threat. She saw me as a bridesmaid. She had the crabs dress me in a gown made of jellyfish silk, which, let me tell you, is incredibly itchy and smells like rotting kelp, and locked me in a cage of whale ribs to await the ceremony." There was a ding sound from a timer at the other side of the kitchen. "This is where I stop for now," Miranda said, turning off the stove. "The fajitas are ready." "Mom, you can't stop there. You were in a whale rib cage. Dad was about to become a stepfather to 1,000,000 crab babies." "Patience, Madison," Miranda said, setting the table. "Your father will be home in 10 minutes. He's much better at describing the escape. He's the one who had to deal with the royal anointing after all." "The what?" "Butter," Miranda said cryptically. "A lot of melted, clarified butter." Part 3. The Witness. The front door of the Miller household creaked open, followed by the familiar thud of a briefcase hitting the hardwood. Malcolm Miller, head of Miller & Associates, wearer of expensive ties, and current candidate for least likely crab prince, walked into the kitchen. He looked tired, the kind of tired only a long commute in Miami traffic can produce. "Dad!" Madison blurted out before he could even say hello. "Tell Mom she's crazy. Tell her the story about the giant crab queen and the jellyfish silk dress is just a weird metaphor for, I don't know, puberty?" Malcolm paused, one hand on the refrigerator handle. He looked at Miranda, who was calmly dishing out fajita meat, then back at his daughter. He let out a long, weary sigh, a sigh that carried the weight of decades. "She told you about the jellyfish silk?" he asked, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Yes, and the St. Bernard-sized crabs, and the wedding." "Right," he began. "Just keep in mind that your mother sometimes embellishes things for dramatic effects." Madison felt the tension leave her body. She really needed her dad's calm and logic demeanor right now. "First of all, they weren't St. Bernard-sized. Think more like British Bulldogs." "Come again?" said Madison, feeling a strain on her neck that wasn't there before. Malcolm pulled out a chair and sat down. He didn't laugh. He didn't roll his eyes. He just looked at the table and said, "Also, she gets the color of the crabs wrong. They weren't just violet. They had a sort of oil-slick sheen to them. Like gasoline on a puddle, and there were 6 of them carrying me, not 4. I was a heavy kid, Maddie. I'd just eaten a whole plate of Kahlua pork." Madison's jaw hit the floor. "So, it's real? You were actually kidnapped by a crustacean monarch?" "Real as the mortgage," Malcolm said grimly, "and twice as stressful. Your mother forgot the worst part, the royal anointing." "The butter," Madison whispered, remembering her mother's cryptic comment. "Gallons of it." Malcolm shuddered. "Clarified. They have these thermal vents in the floor of the grotto that keep it at a perfect, simmering temperature. They believe that a prince consort should be, well, glistening and tender. I spent 3 hours being basted by a crab with a giant kelp brush while a choir of barnacles hummed the hymn of the depths at me. It was humiliating, Madison. And very, very slippery." Miranda sat down, a playful glint in her eyes. "You have to admit, Malcolm, you've never had better skin than you did that week. The omega-3s alone." "I smelled like a red lobster for a month, Miranda." The tension in the room shifted. The skepticism that had been holding Madison together evaporated, replaced by a frantic, dizzying curiosity. Her parents weren't just boring suburbanites. They were veterans of a subterranean war. "How did you get out?" Madison asked. "The high tide was coming. The wedding was supposed to happen." "That," Malcolm said, reaching for a tortilla, "was where your mother finally stopped being a bridesmaid and started being a problem." Part 4, The Great Escape. The grotto was filling with the sound of the rising tide, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that shook the coral towers. The crab queen sat upon her whale skull throne, clicking her massive chele in anticipation. The violet and oil-slick army had gathered, thousands of them, creating a carpet of clicking shells that sounded like a hailstorm on a tin roof. Miranda, still trapped in her whale rib cage, had been watching the guards. Crabs, she noticed, were incredibly disciplined, but lacked imagination. They followed the queen's vibrations perfectly, but they didn't know how to handle a 12-year-old girl with a hidden Swiss Army knife and a burning hatred for jellyfish silk. "The silk was the key." Miranda took over the narration. "It was sticky. When I finally cut myself free from the dress, I didn't just discard it. I used the fibers to gum up the hinges of the cage. Then, I used my snorkel, the one I'd sharpened, as a lever." With a grunt of effort, Miranda had popped the rib bone lock. She slipped out, nearly invisible in the dim bioluminescent light. Meanwhile, Malcolm was being prepared for the vow of the shell. He was standing on a pedestal of salt, covered in butter and draped in a cape made of braided sea grapes. The queen approached him, her massive eyes glowing. "The golden one shall speak the words." The queen's vibrations rumbled. "He shall swear to never seek the dry lands again. He shall be the anchor of my kingdom." "I was supposed to say I do in crab vibration," Malcolm said. But just as I opened my mouth, a literal spear made of sharpened bamboo and sea urchin spines whistled past my ear and embedded itself in the queen's left eye stalk. "It wasn't a spear," Miranda corrected. "It was a curtain rod from the queen's own guest chambers. I'd improvised." The queen let out a screech that shattered half the coral windows in the city. The army went into a frenzy, their military precision dissolving into chaotic snapping. "Miranda dropped from the ceiling like a ninja," Malcolm said, his eyes wide with the memory. She hit the salt pedestal, grabbed my hand, and we both slipped. Remember, I was covered in butter. It worked in our favor. Miranda laughed. The guards tried to grab us, but they couldn't get a grip. We were like two greased pigs at a county fair. We slid right through the front gates of the palace, down a coral slide, and into the main kelp processing district. The chase was legendary. The Golden One and his bridesmaid were pursued by the elite claw guard, crabs the size of motorcycles with shells as hard as diamonds. We reached the mouth of the deep just as the tide reached its peak, Miranda said. The tunnel was filling with water. We had to swim for it, but the queen wasn't letting us go that easily. She dragged herself out of the throne room, her one good eye burning with a prehistoric rage. She blocked the exit. She was huge, Malcolm added, and she was hungry. The wedding was off. She decided she'd rather have a surf and turf dinner. This was the final battle, Miranda said, her voice turning serious. We were trapped between a giant, vengeful crustacean and a tunnel that was rapidly running out of air. And all we had was a snorkel, a Swiss Army knife, and a very small amount of stolen royal detonators. Wait, Madison gasped. What are royal detonators? Basically, Malcolm grinned, highly pressurized sea slugs that explode when you squeeze them. Don't ask how they work. It's a biology nightmare. Part 5. The detonation. The water was already waist-high and rising fast, swirling around the jagged coral pillars of the tunnel entrance. The crab queen loomed over them, her remaining eye glowing with a terrifying, rhythmic pulse. Behind her, the claw guards scuttled forward, their massive pincers snapping like hydraulic shears. We were cornered, Malcolm said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. The air was getting thin, and the smell of the sea was overwhelming. I was still slippery from the butter, which was the only reason I hadn't been crushed yet. I was sliding around like a hockey puck. Miranda gripped the small pulsating pouch of royal detonators she'd swiped from the armory. These were the sea slugs of the deep, indigo creatures that lived in high-pressure vents and reacted violently to sudden decompression. The queen didn't just want us back, Miranda explained. She wanted to make an example of us. She reared up on her back 6 legs, exposing the soft, pale underbelly of her cephalothorax. It was the only weak spot she had. "Give me the slugs, Miranda!" Malcolm had shouted over the roar of the incoming tide. "No, you're too oily!" she'd yelled back. "You'll drop them!" In a moment of sheer 12-year-old desperation, Miranda didn't throw the detonators. She used the sticky jellyfish silk from her discarded dress to tether the slugs to the end of her sharpened snorkel. "It was a makeshift harpoon," Madison whispered, captivated. "Exactly," Miranda nodded. "I told your father to draw her fire, or, well, her pincers." "I had to do a literal song and dance," Malcolm admitted, leaning back in his chair. "I started doing the Macarena. It was 1998, Maddie. It was the most distracting thing I knew. I was sliding and dancing in 2 feet of water, chanting, 'Hey, Macarena,' while a prehistoric monster tried to lob my head off." While the queen was momentarily baffled by Malcolm's butter-slicked choreography, Miranda dove. She swam through the churning water, ducking under a massive violet claw that shattered a coral pillar where her head had been a second before. She surfaced directly beneath the queen's belly and jammed the snorkel harpoon into the soft tissue. "I squeezed the slugs as I pulled the trigger," Miranda said. The explosion wasn't a fire and brimstone blast. It was a massive, concussive wave of bubbles and blue ink. The pressure change was so intense it sent the queen reeling backward, her massive shell slamming into the tunnel ceiling and triggering a localized cave-in. "The whole grotto started to collapse," Malcolm said. "The queen was buried under tons of coral and pearl-encrusted rock." The guards scattered, without their queen's vibrations to guide them. They were just mindless animals again. Part 6. The surface. The escape was a blur of salt and adrenaline. With the tunnel collapsing and the tide surging, Malcolm and Miranda had to swim through the dark, guided only by the fading blue glow of the bioluminescent barnacles. "I thought we weren't going to make it," Miranda said softly. "The water was everywhere. I lost my snorkel. I lost my Swiss Army knife. I only had Malcolm's hand." "And I had hers," Malcolm added. "I used the last of the butter slick on my skin to slide us through a narrow crack in the rock that should have been too small for 2 people. We popped out of the mouth of the deep like corks from a bottle." They had collapsed on the white sands of the North Shore, coughing up seawater and shivering under the moonlight. The cave entrance was gone, sealed by the collapse and hidden once more by the high tide. "We sat there for an hour just looking at the stars," Miranda said. "Malcolm still smelled like a seafood boil, and I was covered in jellyfish goo. We promised right then and there that we'd never tell anyone. They'd put us in a psych ward." "But you told me," Madison said, her brain finally catching up to the reality of her parents' lives. "Why now?" Miranda smiled, a warm, secret sort of expression. "Because you asked if we ever had an adventure, and because tomorrow you're going to the beach with that boy from your chemistry class." Madison blinked. "Liam? What does Liam have to do with crab queens?" "Nothing, hopefully," Malcolm said, standing up to clear the plates. "But if he starts talking about the Golden One or takes you near any caves, you make sure you have a snorkel in your bag, and maybe something to remove butter, just in case." Madison looked at her parents, the businessman and the bell pepper chopping mother. They seemed so normal, so Miami. But as her father walked past, the light caught a small, faint scar on his shoulder, shaped like the serrated edge of a crab's pincer. She looked down at her iced tea. She didn't think she'd ever look at a seafood menu the same way again. "One more thing, Dad," Madison called out as he headed toward the sink. "Did you ever find that blue sea glass? The piece you were looking for before you got kidnapped?" Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out his keychain. Hanging next to his car keys was a small, perfectly smooth cobalt blue shard of glass, wire-wrapped in silver. "Found it in my pocket when we washed up on the beach," he winked. "A prince has to have at least one souvenir from his kingdom." Madison sat in the quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The world felt bigger than it had 20 minutes ago, stranger, more dangerous, and infinitely more exciting. "Fajitas are getting cold, Maddie," Miranda said, nudging a plate toward her. "Eat up. You need your strength if you're going to survive 10th grade. It's almost as tough as a crustacean wedding." Madison took a bite, realized she was starving, and started planning how to fit a snorkel into her beach bag. The end.
If you enjoyed this quick escape, hit the subscribe button for new stories twice a week. Until then, I'll see you at the next flip of the pages.